A warm welcome to all of you to Beloved Archives in Hamilton, New Jersey. Today we will be learning a little bit about Meher Baba's ministry and his work in Australia and the impact he created in Down Under in Australia. The earliest Baba lovers in Australia first heard of Meher Baba through Inayat Khan, one of the Sufi masters who first brought Sufism to the United States. And then through a German baron whose name was von Frankenberg, who brought Sufism into Australia and led the Sufi groups in Melbourne and Sydney. He came in contact with one of Meher Baba's close Mandalian disciples, Francis Brabazon, and his first meetings were in Melbourne and Sydney, and Melbourne in the home of John and Joan Bruford. Bernard Bruford is the son of John Bruford. So this is a bit of a early introduction to the early Sufis who came to Australia. And when the Baron established himself in Australia, he set up more or less a center in a place called Camden and conducted regular classes over there. Then Francis Brabazon came to Melbourne, and in the late 1920s, around 1928, and he met up with John Bruford in the Melbourne Gallery Art School, where he developed a very close friendship with John and Joan Bruford. Now they are the centerpieces, one of those who initiated the early group of Sufis were in their home. They had these meetings in their home. But Francis was a restless soul. He wanted to meet a living spiritual master. So someone invited him for a Buddhist meeting, and also later on he met the Baron, and there was immediate recognition, and he figured that this was the master he was going to follow. So when Francis asked the Baron to join him and to be a student under him, the Baron turned him down. Then sometime later he asked the Baron again that he wanted to become one of his students, and the Baron turned him down. Then the third time when he asked him, he accepted him as a student. So then the lessons that were conducted in the home of John and Joan Bruford, they also studied at that time the discourses. And now the scene shifts to the United States, where the head of the Sufis was a woman called Rabia Martin. Inayat Khan, Hazrat Inayat Khan, had appointed her as the Sufi Murshid. So when she recognized Meher Baba's divinity and declared that he was the avatar of the age, she started to send discourses, copies of discourses, to this Sufi group in Australia. And they first became acquainted with Meher Baba through these discourses. In those days, these discourses were in 5 volumes, and that's what they studied in these Sufi classes. So we will talk with Bernard about his early years with both the Baron, both with the Sufi group as well as his meetings with Meher Baba. But just to give you a little bit about Bernard and his wife Joanne, they have dedicated their adult life to the service of Meher Baba. And Meher Baba visited their home in 1956 when Bernard was just 13 years old. He had met Meher Baba again at Avatar's abode. When Baba came in 1956, Avatar's abode was not in existence. But when he came in 1958, it was, and that's what Bernard met Meher Baba in his home in Melbourne. And both he and his sister Joanna, as different from Joanne, met Meher Baba, and Meher Baba charted the course of their life and asked them if they wanted to live on Avatar's abode, which Bernard and his sister agreed, if their parents were willing to also live on Avatar's abode. In 1971, he married Joanne. They have 3 children, and today Bernard serves on the board of Avatar's abode and is a tireless worker. He and his wife are both tireless workers in the cause of the beloved. So I figured that since we are on an adventure of how the Sufi groups morphed into becoming Meher Baba followers, that we would start by asking a few questions of Bernard about the early years. So my first question is, did the Sufi group in Melbourne learn about Meher Baba when Murshida Martin announced that she had recognized Meher Baba as the Avatar? Because Murshida Martin was searching for a master for a very long time. And she first heard of Meher Baba when Princess Norina Machabali and Elizabeth Patterson were in San Francisco looking for a place for a center for Meher Baba to come to. And Norina was given the task of giving talks about Meher Baba when Murshida Martin happened to hear Meher Baba's name and learned about Meher Baba. She met them and then followed them to New York, where she learned more about Meher Baba. And then instantly had that recognition of Meher Baba as the Avatar. So my first question is, did the Melbourne group learn about from Murshida Martin?
Jai Baba. I was born in 1943, so we've got a situation where I don't know the exact dates, 1944, 45, there is Sufi meetings beginning in our house in Melbourne, in that Francis Brabazon and my father, as Naosherwan said, got to know each other at the art school in Melbourne. And although I don't know all the history, I'm pretty confident that if Francis found something which he considered important, he would have gone out of his way to share it with my father straight away. That was the relationship. And so Rabia Martin sends to Baron von Frankenberg Discourses of Maya Barber. And I'm pretty sure that already in Melbourne, because of Francis having found Sufism in about 1944, almost certainly as soon as the discourses got to the Baron and then to Francis Brabazon, they would have got to our house in Melbourne and shared at Barber meetings. So I'm now getting forgetful of your question, and
now what we'll follow it up by saying that Francis Brabazon was a very important part of the Sufi group in Australia. And at one point, when Baron Frankenberg realized that Meher Baba was a spiritual personage, it was before, he sent Francis to the United States to meet with Murshida Martin and take her to see Meher Baba.
If I could come in there, it
Yes.
was actually Murshida Martin wrote to the Baron and asked the Baron, would you please accompany me to India to meet Meher Baba?
Right.
And the Baron had his own health issues, apart from Rabia, and the Baron also had financial reasons of he would have had to have cleared things with the tax department. But the Baron, in consultation with Rabia, sent Francis instead. And
When Francis landed in California, she told him that it is rumored that Meher Baba might be coming to America, and therefore there would be no reason for us to go and see Meher Baba. But her health was deteriorating. She had cancer, and before long she passed away. Meanwhile, Francis decided to stay on and work at the Sufi Center, which was based in a place called Fairfax.
She did not meet Baba.
No, she passed away before meeting Baba. But before she passed away, she appointed Murshida Deuce as her successor and advised her to go and see Meher Baba at the very earliest, at the first opportunity that she would get. So Murshida Deuce's husband was a very senior executive in an oil company, and they were good friends of the king of Saudi Arabia, so who invited them to visit Saudi Arabia. And Murshida Deuce wrote to Baba asking him whether she could come with her daughter Charmian to see Baba in Merazad. So in 1948, soon after Merazad opened, they were one of the first guests to have come to be with Baba. And it was at that time that she handed over Sufism, the organization of Sufism, to Baba.
one little correction, please.
Yes.
You mentioned how Rabia Martin had died, and you mentioned how Francis decided. Francis was the pupil of Baron von Frankenberg, and Francis wrote to the Baron asking permission to stay on. It was not his way to make a decision like that without consulting the Baron. Yeah, minor point, but Francis would never make decisions without consulting his master.
Right.
And while Francis was in America, he was getting a small allowance from the Baron. And when he asked to stay longer, he said that he would not require extra money, and that he could live on less than the allowance, and he was going to try and earn some extra money of his own. And Francis lived very frugally, and the Baron knew that. So the Baron had no objections to Francis staying a bit longer, and Francis was learning more about Sufism and Meher Baba while he was there.
Right.
And one little point too, Ivy Juice, as you said, going to go and hopefully meet Baba. When Francis knew that, he asked Ivy Juice, Mercia Juice, to please take with her a letter from Francis to Baba, and in that letter Francis asked Baba would he ever meet with Baba.
Right. So my question is, who appointed Francis Brabazon as a Sufi sheikh, and was the title of Khalifa given to him by Murshid the Deuce?
The title of Caliph was not given to him till 1952, and I've read one account where it was Murshid Juice a week before he met Baba in 1952. Another account said it was Sam Lewis who initiated him to Caliph. There's two different versions.
Okay.
And in Francis returned to Australia in 1948, and Francis said it was then decided, and it's not clear whether that's 49, the Baron died in 1950, but it was decided that Francis would take over the Camden, in effect Sydney group, and also the Melbourne group. And it was in 1949, while the Baron was still alive, that Francis purchased the land in northern suburbs of Sydney, suburb of Beacon Hill, and he built there a house out of stone that's known as Mayor House.
Mayor House. Now the interesting thing about his physically working on the construction was that, according to Sufi principles, he believed in two things. One was that you have to await the coming of the master, and he expected that Meher Baba would come to Australia sometime. And the second belief that he had was that the Sufis built these homes out of stone. So he built, am I correct about these 2 points?
I've heard that, but it certainly didn't follow through to Avatar's abode.
Yes.
But then Barbara had, which I'm sure we'll come to, in 1958, Barbara had expressed a preference for coming to Queensland, not a Baba lover within 500 miles, and he only had a couple of months to find a place and get it ready for Barbara's visit. Building out of stone would have been impossible.
But would you be able to tell me why Baba decided that he wanted to come to Queensland and not to Sydney or Melbourne?
I'll tell you what I know, and this only became known in the last year when 15 months ago at Avatar's abode we asked the trust at Maribad, the archives, for a cable that Francis Brabazon sent to Baba when he found the property, Avatar's abode, describing it. They couldn't find it, but they sent back the wording from Erich's diary, and Erich's diary, in inverted commas from what Baba said, how the property was excellently suitable. But they did find a letter that Francis had written to Erich, which no one in Australia knew about. Early in 58, at the end of 57, it was already set in concrete that Baba would be coming here to America. But Australia, that wasn't certain. And Francis wrote to Erich to please tell Baba that if he decides to come to Australia besides Myrtle Beach, he had the time and the resources to prepare a place for him. He said that in this letter that yes, it could be where Baba had been in 1956. I regard this letter as Francis trying to make it impossible for Baba, the God-man, to say no. That's how I interpret the letter, because he describes how he could get a place on the coast, he could get it in the mountains, he could get it in the lowlands, he could get it 50 miles away, 100 miles away, he could get it in the country, and even, he says in this letter, and even in Queensland where the mangoes and the bananas grow. Like it was, I interpret as a pleading letter. And it came back through a family letter of money. Baba's sister, in the first week, it was written of January, to say that Baba's preference was Queensland. Now, we had no one in Australia up until 15 months ago knew that Francis had even made that suggestion. Francis also said in the letter, whether weather is amiable, I can't remember the exact thing. So that is all I know.
I'm glad I asked that.
I might also add here that June is the winter in Australia. So that the climate would have been a lot more pleasant, and it's also usually the dry season. So it would be milder than Sydney, and also almost certainly dry. And although Baba's visit to Sydney in 1956 had also been in the winter, Baba's health had deteriorated, so it was probably more important for him to have the warmer climate. That's my speculation.
My speculation is that Francis, in addition to Baba had set a preference, that would have been sufficient in itself. Right. But Francis was conscious that Baba was cold in Melbourne in 56 when he went to Melbourne, and Francis would have been so conscious that this is an opportunity to have another part of Australia which Baba had blessed with his presence.
I'd like to go back to one point where when the discourses were sent to the groups, they studied the discourses along with the Sufi classes that were being held. But on the other hand, the Baron Frankenberg, von Frankenberg, who was also known as Momin, wanted a certain degree of certainty of Meher Baba's stature. So he started a correspondence with Meher Baba, which was conducted by Dr. Abdul Ghani Munsif. And just very recently, we received 29 letters exchanged between the Baron and Dr. Munsif from the Avatar Meher Baba Trust in India, where the Momin is constantly asking, the Baron is constantly asking questions of Abdul Ghani Munsif, and he's responding accordingly. So, to continue in the same vein, some of the followers, some of the members, families of the Sufi group became Meher Baba followers, and others remained Sufis.
When Francis took over from Baron von Frankenberg, and that was in 1952, sometime in the next couple of years, I assume it was after Francis had met Baba here in America in 1952, Francis, as the leader of the Sufi group, gave all the Sufis three choices. To be released from their vows and go. Now, we know, I had one family friend who had taken the vows about being a Sufi, but felt she'd made a wrong decision. she just jumped at the opportunity. Now with a free hand she could leave without having broken vows. Francis gave the choice of staying with Sufism, and we don't know. I haven't heard of anyone who knows of anyone who stayed on with Sufism. And the other one was to be released from your vows and follow Meher Baba. But Francis becoming the leader after the Baron died, like Francis describes how before the Baron's death it was decided that he would take over the Sufi leadership. Whether that was a day before he died or a year before he died, we don't know. Francis, there was some opposition to Francis taking over from the Baron. Now, Meher Baba is well entrenched in Sufi meetings, and we even in Melbourne had the situation where one couple, Stan and Clarice Adams, Stan had Sufi meetings at his house, and those meetings had nothing to do with Sufism. It was the link direct with Baba. Whereas at the Bruford house, it was a slow transition to it becoming Baba and Sufism not being there. Francis, he would stay at our house and the Baron on their trips to Melbourne from Camden, which is outside of Sydney. And I have got a nice little letter when I was 6 years old, in the Baron's handwriting. I can remember the event of him giving both myself and my sister a little flashlight to help us see our way in the dark. Can you remember the wording? But
and I hope whenever you use this torch, flashlight, you will remember your Uncle Momin, who loves you very much because you are such a sweet boy.
Right. But then your narration just gives me the thought that there was a split. Would you say there was a split between the Baba group and the Sufi group?
Well, yes, to finish that, Stan Adams's group was no Sufism finished. The other group, which Clarice Adams came to, his wife, Stan's wife, to the Bruford house, that kept Sufism going. Like even letters about how to repeat the Lord's name, Baba, the in-breath, the out-breath. So it was Baba meetings with a Sufi influence. And the split was not in personalities. In it, I know Stan Adams and my father were great friends, but the meetings were held in different places, one with the emphasis purely on Baba, some where the Sufism influence was gradually going away, dissipating.
There's a very interesting letter that we found, John Bruford writing to Francis in 1954, and John describes the meetings that are being held in the Bruford house, and this is 1954, and John talks about how he's having trouble with repeating Baba's name. Now, I'd always imagined that was just repeating Baba's name was repeating Baba's name, but it's clear that there's still a Sufi influence in how to do it with in-breaths and out-breaths. And Bernard's father had polio when he was very young and didn't sort of grow very tall and had reduced lung capacity. In this letter, John Bruford says about how he's having trouble with this technique because of his reduced lung capacity. So I think that's evidence that there was still, it was very much Baba, but still with some of the Sufi practices.
Although the meetings there were meetings in the Bruford house, Sufi meetings which became Baba meetings, it was doors shut, children excluded. And when we talk of 56, I'll bring that topic up again.
Well, this is for Joanne. Joanne, you met Francis in 1970.
Yes.
After Baba dropped his body.
Yes.
So what were your first impressions of him? Was he still the sheikh, or was he had come entirely into Baba's fold?
Well, my first impression was of extreme relief because Bernard had given me a printout of a talk that Barbara had given.
Francis.
That Francis had written after Barbara adopted his body, and from this talk that I'd read of Francis sounded like a very serious person indeed, that I would find very intimidating. But when I met him, there was no intimidation whatsoever. He was quite small. He wore a woolly hat. He was very warm and completely friendly, not at all sort of imposing. And I later got to love him and respect him a great deal. But that first impression was he's lovely.
Can I tell a story related to that?
Sure.
Robert Rouse and his wife Lorna, that's the other family which in 1958 were directed to go and live on Avatar's abode and farm. Robert and Lorna was seeking out Francis, and I think it was in 1954 or 55, and seeking him out because someone had borrowed a book, and Robert heard that the guy who had lent this book had flamencan records. Flamenco, Spanish music. And Robert, who was very keen on that kind of music, offered to return the book. So went looking for Francis. He had been warned that Francis was a bit of a god botherer, was the terminology Robert used. And anyway, they did, to cut the story short, when they finally found the place, they were welcomed by a lady with a cigarette hanging out her mouth, ironing. That's Clarice Adams, who was living at Beacon Hill. And Robert and Lorna were just so pleased that this guy, Francis, must be all right if someone can be ironing there with a cigarette.
So since we are narrating stories, on May 4th, 1965, Mayor Baba had invited me to spend the day with him and in Guru Prasad in Pune. And Erich, in those days I used to write a lot of poems, and I had sent a manuscript of my poems to Francis, asking him to write the foreword and so forth. So Erich Jasawala, Mayor Baba's secretary and companion, was very anxious that I become a protege of Francis Brabazon. And so when I landed there during the break, when Baba was having his cup of tea, my session was in the morning, and when Baba was having a cup of tea, Erich egged me on, go and meet Francis, go and meet Francis. So I went up to Francis, and he did look a little intimidating, considering he was such a great poet. So I didn't know where to begin, or what to say to him. So the first words that came out of my mouth were, I'm very fond of Milton as a poet. And I don't know why I said that, because I had, of course, read Milton, and I had studied Milton, and I was fond of Milton, but I happened to say this. So Francis looks sharply at me and says, the first thing you need to do is to throw Milton over the precipice. So this was my first introduction to Francis. But of course, he was very good and kind. Before he left India for Australia, after Baba dropped his body, he left all his books and his magazines to me. So going back to, so now that we've completed the part about the beginnings of the Sufi movement and how a very large number of them became Baba lovers, we move to Meher Baba's arrival in Sydney on August 9, 1956. Bernard was 13 years old at that time, and Baba came to his home in Melbourne. So could you share a few stories, experiences of your early meetings with Baba in 1956?
Good. Baba arrived in Sydney. We were 500 miles south in Melbourne. Bruford family had flown to Sydney. We were there an hour before Baba arrived. There is a film clip of Baba walking from the plane to the arrival hall, and that was my first vision of Baba. I was used from photos, I was used to the long hair and pyjamas and Indian way of dressing, but the way he walked, we'd never seen any footage of Baba. So just to see him now walking, and as can be seen on films, he had a beautiful walk, and it commanded one's attention. But as a 13-year-old, what really impressed me was going round to the doors after immigration and customs, where people wait to meet people from overseas, and I was very, very impressed. Baba knew who the people were that had come to meet him and to transport him back to Mayor House. And my sister tells how she was 3 deep, and Baba even leant over to greet her. And for this person to know who to say hello to, that for me was impressive. And little incidents. First morning, the first session was going to be, I can't remember the time, 9 o'clock. So, but I talked of how in Melbourne the Sufi Baba meetings, doors closed, no children. The word comes out, Baba wants all the children half an hour before this meeting with the adults. So here we are, preferential treatment now. So that was noticeable. And the younger ones could observe Erich braiding Baba's hair. So this is the first time I'm in close contact with Baba, but it just all seemed so natural, like it wasn't getting used to a strange person. It's just as if it was a family member I hadn't seen for a week or two. It was, yes, he had different clothes, but he was totally natural, nothing forced at all. Francis had told me in advance that he played marbles, and how he suggested that I might like to do some practicing, and how he suggested I should perhaps have some in my pocket. And I did have 5 marbles in my pocket and handed 4 to Baba, and he got me to hold one here, and from a bit further away, about 3.5, 4 feet, Baba sitting in a chair, spring-loads a finger and pings the marble. I know he missed the first time, but I was used to playing marbles, and the noise of when his marble hit the one I was holding, that was a noise I'd never heard before. I'd never seen a marble move at such velocity in my life. It didn't smash the marble, but the noise suggested it could have. And then he asked us younger ones to have a go. Well, we'd put the marble in, and like the marble had just, if you try it for a first time, it doesn't work very well if you've never done it before. And I was quite embarrassed, 13 years of age, and I tried to explain to Baba, that's not how we play. Oh, says Baba, show me. So he then watched us play on the floor, and which I include in all the talks I give, how as the younger ones were ushered out, Baba walked with us to the door. We're about to go out, and Baba asks, who am I? And I can't remember if it was 3 or 4 of us there, but the first, I was the last person in the line, and Baba was very pleased with each answer. And then, obviously very pleased. And then my spontaneous answer was, the greatest man on earth. And he was so happy, arms up in the air. So I'd never, as I've said in other talks, I didn't know what the word ego meant. I'd never heard it, but whereas it was smashed with plain marbles, I left a very happy person.
Very nice.
Keep going.
I wanted to intersperse this with one little anecdote. Among the many people who came to meet Baba, greet Baba, and so on and so forth, there was a man called John Grant. And he's written a marvelous book. I'd say one of the finest books in Meher Baba literature. It's called Practical Spirituality with Meher Baba.
Excuse me.
So in that book, he narrates this little story of his first meeting with Baba. He sees Baba, but he's not certain. Is he who he really says he is? So Baba is walking ahead, and he turns and he does this to Baba, and Baba turns round and does this to John. And
actually, they were in two different cars
yes.
when this happened. Yeah.
So no, that was the third time.
Beg your pardon, sorry.
So the second time, Baba is again moving away, a distance away, and he says, that could be a fluke. Let me try it again. So he does it again, and Baba turns round and smiles and does this to him again. And then they were in two separate cars, and he sees Baba's car, and he's driving in one car, and he does this to Baba again, and Baba had his face turned. He turns his face and does this to him. And then he was convinced that yes, he is the one. Please continue.
Perhaps down to Melbourne.
Beg your pardon?
I think the play. The quest.
Okay.
Yeah. On the first day, festival day, Francis had prepared a play to be performed, The Quest, and Francis played the part of the seeker. And I'm 13 years of age, and I point out that at that time in 1956, the only books available for people who wanted to find out about Meher Baba, like myself, was I could try the discourses, or I could go to God Speaks, and if I wanted something really out there, I could go to the Wayfarers. That's not much for a 13-year-old to pick and choose from. There was no videos, no films, no one... Pardon?
No YouTube.
No YouTube, no. And no one my age to swap notes with. So I have to clarify that my answer, the greatest man on earth, that was spontaneous, but I didn't know what God was. I didn't relate God to my daily life, which Baba lovers today try and relate. What Baba's offers, his story of love, they try to apply it in their daily life. That didn't occur to me. So Francis is performing this play, and at the end of it, Baba makes it clear how happy he is and says to Francis, I can't remember the words, I think they are actually recorded, but I thought of it as a reward because Baba was very pleased. And my mind said, I wonder what it'll be that Baba's going to give Francis. And what he gave Francis was what I describe as a prison sentence. 28 days solitary confinement, only a certain quantity of milk a day, which you could have in tea or coffee. I think the room was to be not natural light, like all these restrictions, and
no interaction with anybody else.
No interaction with anybody. Someone could bring him the milk. I don't know what arrangements were made for toilet, but anyway, it was solitary confinement. But then, okay, again, more evidence, I don't understand God, but then Francis, in the most humble of ways, with his head on his side, hands together, says, thank you, Baba, and then bows down. So not only does this God business mean prison sentences, but it also means saying thank you when you get it. That had an impression.
Yes.
Moved to Melbourne?
Yeah.
More? Good.
Sure.
Good. Okay, he's coming to our house in Melbourne. Short notice. Those who Francis had asked who in Melbourne would be willing to offer their house to Barbara and the Mundley, and he stayed at one place but said he now wanted a short notice to visit the other places. Our place was first on the drive with an entourage and very little time to prepare. Our house was in a mess because we'd in a hurry gone up to Sydney. Now we're back. We've got visitors from Sydney we weren't expecting. So mother and father's bed, that's where we'll put everything from around the house to tidy it up. So the first room that Barbara wants to go to is that room. So then in the sister's room, or my room, I'd put neat little piles here and there. I'd tidied it. Barbara says, "Is it always like this?" And I had to say no. And in the sister's case, she had put a hold of stuff behind a wardrobe and closed the door. And sister tells how Barbara caught her eye, looked at the wardrobe door, and then caught her eye again. It was a little play between the two of them. At the end of this tour, there's one room that hasn't been gone, the door has not been opened, and mother says no one goes in there. And
Bernard's mother could be quite authoritative too, you know. No, nobody goes in there.
And this is Daddy's workroom, and this workroom was a total mess. The only time I ever heard my parents argue, only time, was one time when father was at work away, mother tidied this room, and that caused quite a little explosion, and she never tried to tidy it again, and so years would go, like it was a mess. Everything broken to be repaired, furniture under construction, wood shavings all over the place, electronic amplifiers in bits, and around the wall from art school, all these nude women, and anyway, mother says, "Oh, no one goes in there." And Barbara indicated that he wanted to, and mother indicated that, it's not a room for visitors. Anyway, Barbara won. And I can remember standing beside my father when Barbara had won this little backwards and forwards with mother. Mother never said no, but she tried to discourage it. Anyway, my father's words to me quietly was, like he was devastated to think God-man was going in there. Father's words were, "This is what you call hell with your pants down." I think one of the lovely stories from Melbourne is at Farewell in Him in the afternoon, late afternoon. In those days, people waving goodbye could be quite close to the actual plane. There's Barbara at the window waving, and finally the plane taxis off, and we're all staying to see it go up in the air, and we're discussing would we ever see Barbara again, and the plane doesn't take off. And then we hear it. It taxis back and turns to exactly where it was 10 minutes earlier, and there's Barbara at the window again, so we have more waves, and then after a minute or two it does go. But what's so beautiful is Barbara told those on the plane it was their love that brought me back. So that was very touching
nice
story. Yeah.
So then Barbara left in 1956, and then there was the possibility that he might come again. So by that time, Avtara's abode land had been bought. Francis was working on it. How did all of you, including you, prepare for Barbara's second visit in 1958? What went into the preparation for that visit?
I will begin with what Baba said when he went back to India. And a little aside, Baba, when he quipped at Avatar's abode, he'd be going from Mumbai to Mumbai. That was a little quip. But he, in sharing his travels, America, Australia, with the Women Mandali, he said of Francis and the purchase of Avatar's abode and what you've just asked about, Baba's words to the Women Mandali was, "What daring?" Now, the daring is that an 80-acre property with no electricity, no running water, no sewerage, he, in just a matter of less than 4 months, got it ready for Baba. It was the end, 500 yards up a dead-end road with no houses on that road. There were extreme, in March, April, extreme wet weather. But Francis decided that the best place to build a new house for Baba was right beside where the only house on the property of 80 acres, it was already there. So he decided to move that house and build another one. What he built was a tin shed, and with wooden floor, but tin corrugated iron sides, corrugated iron roof. The framework was all steel, prefabricated steel, where you bolt it together. But Baba's room was built inside this shed. It was built to last 700 years out of Australian hardwood, floor, walls and ceiling, with the 3-inch wide verticals all screwed with brass screws from behind. So the timeline was such that what we call the meeting hall, that was only decided, I'd say 4 days before Baba came, that yes, there would be time to put it up. And to build that meeting hall, dirt floor, metal kerosene drums with planks, very rudimentary. The sides on 3 sides were sacking. That was assembled to get it done at night time with 3 or 4 cars pointing its lights with their engines running to stop the batteries going flat. We were short of time.
It's mentioned that the Brufords got there 4 weeks before.
We got there 4 weeks before to help.
How old were you, Bernard?
15 years of age.
15.
And another story you asked about the preparation. Baba has sent word that he's coming now 5 days earlier. Now, that I don't know if that means 5 days less for Americans or whatever, but hammering, I was asked to help with putting floorboards down, and it was 2 nails per board and at each joist. And Francis came in, "Why 2 nails? We haven't got time for 2 nails. 1 nail, we can put the second one in later." Later never came. You can still see 2 nails, 2 nails, 1 nail, 1 nail, 1 nail. And we were short of time. When Francis left to go and meet Baba, to bring him to Avatar's abode, he said, voice of resignation, "I know we've all done our best, but stop work at 5. And women, those who were making curtains and cushions for Baba's chair, they were allowed to stay up, and they did, with a kerosene light till 2 o'clock doing about 2 o'clock, I'm not sure, doing sewing. And just the cement bags. And Francis says goodbye to us, car starts, Francis stops the car, gets out and says, "See all those cement bags? could someone gather them up and perhaps burn them? And like, we were under pressure.
I think you should backtrack a little bit here, Bernard. I think your description of when you arrived at Avatar's abode is worth telling. You arrived 4 weeks early, and Francis met you. And what was the scene that greeted you?
To accommodate 50 odd people, whatever it was, I'd have to check the numbers on the property. Well, mattresses, beds. So go up into the farmhouse which Francis had moved, the original building. There's all these mattresses being made out of, we call it Hessian, sacking, I'm not sure the word you use. And they were mattresses being made with wood wool. So there's a pile of mattresses up to the ceiling, like there's 40, 50 people going to be staying on this property. People making beds to put these mattresses on. It was chicken wire being hammered on. Like absolute chaos. Everyone busy. Francis, he kept his cool throughout. He knew exactly what job. Everyone wanted to please Francis. There was no discussion there. Francis
but he put you through the ringer.
Oh, he did. He had accepted the responsibility of hosting Barbara, and we wanted to be part of that. And the way to be part of that was to help Francis. On one occasion, I was given road work as a 15-year-old. This is before he's coming 5 days earlier. Francis thought he had time to fix up the government road, not on the property. That's hard work. And
Bernard and his sister did this, which involved pushing wheelbarrows piled high with rocks.
Anyway, one day after lunch, someone suggested we gave the men, we had tents to sleep in, suggested we go and lie down. I went to sleep straight away. There's Francis waking me up. I can't remember if it was 2 or 3 minutes past 1. Lunch was 12 to 1. He says, what is the point of coming all the way from Melbourne to help get ready for Barbara if all you're going to do when you get here is go to sleep?
Okay,
I think I'm answering your question.
Yes, you are. Yeah.
It was...
Okay. Onto the drive to...
More stories?
No, so then I wanted to start... With 1958, Baba arrives and he summons you and Joanna, or rather you and Joanna, your sister, are in Baba's presence. And what happens then?
I'm going to go back a little bit. It was day of private interviews. Individuals in and out, couples in and out. My parents went in. They didn't come out. And I can remember feeling very embarrassed. I was very self-conscious that here's the Bruford family mucking it up for everyone else. Never once did I think, how fortunate are they? But finally the door opens. It's Erich, not my parents. And he calls in Sister and I. And we go in and there's Barbara. And he says, what do we think about coming and living here on Avatar's abode? My parents had only lived in one house since they were married. And my answer, sister, similar, if that's what our parents are doing. And Barbara was pleased, and so we go out. And I could go for 10 minutes on this story, but relevant things are that Francis had followed Barbara's preference for a place in Queensland. That place up there. No one knew anyone who had ever been to Queensland. There's not a Barbara lover within 400 or 500 miles of Queensland. And Barbara has indicated to some of those at the Savas that instructions that would be coming at the end of June or early July, the same as instructions for Americans who are at the Myrtle Beach Savas, that when these instructions come, almost certainly Francis would be called to India. Now, Francis Actually, Francis's instruction wasn't not to come to India, but his instruction said there'll be further instructions in October, and that it said come to India. The question is, Barber had named the property Avatar's Abode. He wasn't asked to. He came up with the idea of naming it. And he said it's going to be a place in 700 years of world pilgrimage. Now, not a Barber lover in 400 or 500 miles. Does Francis just go to India and as the place grows weeds? Like, what's going to happen to it? No Barber lovers within 500 more miles. So Barber, Francis, Erich, whoever cooked up the idea that two families would come and farm. And Francis, when Barber made it clear when he was here that Robert would be in charge.
Robert
Rouse. He also asked Francis where the families would live. And Francis suggested they could all live in this original farmhouse, 2 bedrooms and a sleep out, 8 people, work it out, and like to live forevermore with no electricity.
And Robert and Lorna Rouse had a 2-year-old daughter who was still in diapers and there was no running water.
Anyway, Mother said to Barber, we will be selling our place in Melbourne. We'd have the money to build our own house. And what about that? And Barber said, yes, that would be better. But Francis made it very clear later on that he could not comprehend how Mother had the audacity, with all her Sufi training, to ask the master for anything. And that was totally against Sufi principles. You do not ask. But she did ask.
2 families.
Only 2 families.
Why do you think there were only 2 families? I mean, I know that it's Barber's will, but any...
Well, in terms of viability of farming, like what are they going to do there? In those days, if you worked hard, you could perhaps survive farming. But once the chemicals came into it and the economies of scale, it was not viable. So why Barber did it that way, I just mentioned, could I take a little further with Francis? He's going to be called to India. He'd been twice in 54, once in 55, and Barber had said Robert to be in charge, and Francis reiterated that before he went, that Robert's in charge, but he bought a return ticket. He thought it'd be longer than the 3 and 4 weeks he'd had on previous visits. Francis, following Barber's instructions, went. Barber's instructions never said go home, so he stayed. And in 1962 at the East-West Gathering, he made the point to Australians, it appears that I'm here to stay.
So then your next meeting with Barber was in the East-West Gathering in 1962. Any experiences, any thoughts of that visit?
I can share a nice story, yes. Westerners did meet with Barber of a morning. In the afternoon, hours was spent watching Barber, as you can see on the film, giving darshan. The queue would go past and he'd greet each one. So this was interspersed with some discourses. The 4 Journeys was one such discourse. There was musical interludes. But I spent hours over several days watching Barber, the queue, and I got fascinated by Barber's timing, in that I would notice that Barber would be giving eye contact. As soon as they bow down, Barber would look up and eyes would go round, and I'd notice so often that Barber would put his eyes back just a split second before that person looks up at Barber. And sometimes Barber, it appears he's not going to look back at the person so overcome with having bowed down didn't look up themselves. So I would watch Barber's timing, and so often it was just so exquisite of him greeting the person at just the right moment. Sometimes this didn't happen, and on one occasion, well, you know, Barber might be turned around talking to Erich, whoever. I was asked in India once about the 62 Darshan, you've just asked me, and I shared what I've just shared, but someone said, well, now listen to this, we will add to your story. This person who had just left Mehrabad a few weeks earlier had told her story of how she'd always remembered her joy of being able to bow down to Barber at the East-West gathering, and how she was quite conscious of when she looked up, Barber had his head turned away from her. And although she had the joy of having been part of that Darshan line, she mentioned how she was aware that Barber appeared to be ignoring her. Then she told that story while at Mehrabad, but then some Indians arrive and there's introductions, and this person who's just arrived gets introduced to this lady, and he says, oh, you were at the East-West gathering? Yes. Oh, your name's, give me a name.
Felicity.
Felicity. And she says, yes, but I don't think we've been introduced before. I don't think we've met before. And he says, no, we haven't met, but I remember you at the East-West gathering. I remember you bowing down to Barber. The reason I remember you bowing down to Barber is when you bowed down, I was on the stage and Barber turned round and through Erich told us all how much this person loved him.
What a lovely story.
Yeah. So I like sharing that story. I think it's wonderful.
Yes.
That's
Years after.
Beg your pardon?
this is 20, 30 years later. Yeah.
I'll just add my little story of the East-West gathering. At the East-West gathering, you had everybody sitting by states. So the Westerners were sitting in front, and the rest of the Indians were Andhra Pradesh and Uttar Pradesh and Madhya Pradesh and so forth. So I was sitting in my stage. I hadn't met Baba for many years, and Baba had not come out of the room as yet. And I was thinking that so many people are sitting on the stage. I don't know whether Baba will remember me. It's been so many years that I've met Baba. And then Baba comes out, and literally my hair stood on edge as the entire air is rent with Avtar Meher Baba Ki Jai. And he sits down, and a few minutes later, Erich is on the mic saying, will Naosherwan come to the stage? And I was delighted, and that he had heard my prayer in his silence and in my... so that was a wonderful experience at the East-West gathering. But now I'm going to put Joanne in a spot. So you have often said that you are not a Baba lover.
True.
But after years of being married to Bernard and being in the company of Baba lovers, what do you take Meher Baba to be? And how has he influenced your life?
Well, I'll say how he's influenced my life first, and that would be in an indirect way, that when I first met Bernard's mother and sister, I was very impressed by them, and one of the things that influenced me was that they, although they lived very comfortably, that there was not an emphasis on the usual trappings of middle-class family life in the 1970s. Everything was fairly simple, and I like that. And Bernard's mother, for example, only had a certain number of clothes, and she never bought extra until something was worn out. And when she did get new clothes, they were very nice, and a dressmaker would make her these clothes, but she only had what she needed, and that changed the way I thought about things quite a lot. And the same thing when I first visited India at the end of 1974 and going into 1975. Of course, on the first visit to India, I was very shocked at the poverty and the beggars and all of that. But when I got to the trust office, it was a real haven, But it was very simple. There was a beautiful perfume. Everything was, was swept clean. And going out to Mayurazad, the women mandali were dressed very simply, but very beautifully, and that sort of fitted in with the ethos that I'd picked up from Bernard's mother and sister, and also from Francis. Francis lived very frugally and very simply, but very practically, and that did change my attitude to life. As for Meher Baba himself, when I first met Bernard, he gave me, the first thing he gave me was tapes, and I to listen to, and I think that it was probably Alan Cohen talking, and I found that very interesting, talking about life being a dream within a dream and all of that. I found that very interesting, and I had previously had some interest in Eastern spirituality, and so I was quite curious and interested. But over the years, I've come to believe in any religion as being more of poetry and metaphor, and I don't want to sort of. I don't think God can. I have a lot of trouble imagining God in human form. So I've come to, and I do actually attend a Catholic church, but I don't sort of believe the dogma as being literally true. I feel that I'm just, it's a kind of quiet meditation. I'm linking into something that's bigger than me that I don't have to put into words, and I think Meher Baba is poetry too. But it's not the poetry that touches my heart as much as the poetry of the Christian Bible and the Christian liturgy. That's what appeals to me. I don't know if that makes any sense to anybody.
So who do you take Meher Baba to be?
I suppose a teacher. A teacher in the same way that Jesus was a teacher, but I don't sort of think of Jesus as being God in human form either. So yes, a teacher, and there's wisdom there, but it's this, and the ethos is very compatible with the ethos of Christianity, and Bernard and I have been married for 48 years now, and Bernard might like to tell the story with Francis, which I think makes a lot of sense.
This is very much related to your question, Joanne. Mm-hmm. When Joanne and I were beginning to see each other, and there was an obvious chance that this relationship might develop further, and I went to Francis, he was my godfather. His name is actually Bernard Francis Brabazon, and I'm named after him. I'd discuss anything with him, and I went and discussed the idea of a Baba lover, myself, forming a relationship with a non-Baba lover. And he asked me what I thought and let me go on, and he finally said, look, it's so simple. I can't give you a quote, but the gist of what he said was, two people, they each have their ideals in life. They've each got their idea of right and wrong. They've each got aspirations of where they hope to go with what their values are. And he says the only thing you have to, for two people to consider is, will each one be able to help the other work towards what for them is important? And with that response, from that day on, I've never seen it as an issue that a Barber lover and a non-Barber lover, it's just not an issue. That's how I see that.
And I think over those 48 years, we have helped each other along the path. And the latest example of that, I think, would be Bernard and I working very cooperatively to prepare for this wonderful tour of America. That's very much been a joint effort. And yes, so
it's obviously a wonderful journey.
Yes, indeed.
Very wonderful.
So so a last question, or rather two questions, would be, you went to India for the last darshan in May of 1969, right? And you've mentioned that you had a profound experience at this gathering that superseded all other experiences, including meeting Baba. Would I be correct in saying that, or?
Well, at least partially correct.
Partially correct. Okay.
Yeah, it was bowing down to his supposedly empty chair, which Erich invited us to do, to honour the invitation. I can't remember his words. And I know my attitude was, well, if that's what they do in India, bow down to chairs, I'll follow the leader. In other words, I was attaching no special importance to this, although I was noticing that it was deeply moving for some of those who did. And I can only say that totally unexpected, bowing down, for me, it was just so very intimate, the contact I felt with Baba, a contact within. It was totally different to having met his physical form. Here was meeting on a new, more important level. There is a book written called The Empty Chair, where there's many, many, many such stories, and having read that book, there's different people use the words that I can't adequately explain how I felt. But I, since then, have always carried a conviction, which I think is the most important thing I have to say about this God business, is that what counts is that inner contact. And I am convinced it's there for me at any time I like. I'm convinced it's there for anyone at any time. It's just a matter of getting rid of all the other stuff. And for me, bowing down to that chair at that time, it took away all that other stuff. I had that intimacy with him in a way which I'd never experienced that intimacy before.
Wonderful. And now to end this delightful journey, or at least give it a break, I want to ask you one last question, and that is, in hindsight, do you feel that Francis took the right decision of setting up Avatar's abode in Queensland? And what is the future of Avatar's abode? How do you, as a board member, visualize the future of Avatar's abode?
In terms of whether he made the right decision, categorically, I believe yes, in it. Barbara expressed that preference for Queensland. You could not find a more delightful location at the end of a dead-end road with beautiful surrounds, beautiful panoramas, and to me that's a question I've never considered, whether he made the right decision. The fact that Francis, knowing a bit about how to love and please and serve God, when he found the property, he sent this very detailed description of it to Barbara, and Barbara replied that it is excellently suitable. Now, that I think means he made the right decision. The future of Avatar's abode is that Barbara clearly said that it would become a place of world pilgrimage. Now, its size has been increased from 80 up to 100 acres. Barbara in 1959 or 1960 did accept an adjoining property was offered. He accepted just part of it, but he made it clear it was accepted as part of Avatar's abode. Subsequently, Diana Snow, mother of Dinah Gibson from LA, many of you would know her, she did the Love Street Lamppost magazine. She donated an adjoining block, which has the advantage that it has got an easement, and that means that, many of us believe that in the future, that is when one part of the Avatar's abode trust deed gets implemented of community work. So here is land on adjoining Avatar's abode where there can be activity involving the general public without of them in any way impacting on the beautiful area where Barbara spent time, what we call Barbara's house. The emphasis of the discussions that have to take place for the future of Avatar's abode is someone sometime is going to have to decide on what in our planning will be the maximum number of overnight visitors. Of course, our trust deed makes it clear it has to be available to all, which we assume will be day visitors. But then there's complications of a water supply. There's many issues to look at. So my personal viewpoint is that, and I'm just one of 11 directors on the trust at the moment, I think there's general agreement that this northeast block will, when funds become available, that's when we'll delve into community work, whether it be a women's shelter or whatever, I don't know. And the emphasis will be on having facilities for some overnight accommodation, whether that be put at 20 or 50, perhaps more, I don't know, people, with an emphasis on providing facilities for day visitors. There's problems with where do you park cars, there's lots of issues, and I think they're probably very similar to the issues confronting Myrtle Beach, which is there on a bigger scale than Avatar's abode. We've also got the problems of fire, we've also, another big issue is the security one, which, like other barber centres around the world, we just have to, these days, be more aware of it. So that's some answer to your question.
Bernard, thank you so much for sharing your stories of your life with Barbara. Joanne, thank you so much for coming to Beloved Archives and sharing your stories. And our next, when you come here again, which apparently seems to be on the cards, we will be happy to welcome you both.
I don't know which cards and who's got the aces, but
you are holding the ace.
I would like to please include how grateful Joanne and I are that back in Australia we've got a person named Daniel Montague, and in Northern California someone called Alan Talbot, who it was Daniel who put this idea. He just couldn't understand why we hadn't been asked to come to America beforehand, and it, like, he became fascinated that I'm now the only person alive who knows anything about Avatar's Abode in the 1960s, and he suggested to Alan that the Americans do something about that.
I'm glad he did.
And Alan has formed all these committees headed up by these lovely hosts of ours, and here we are. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oh, one thing that I should have said, I'm sorry, I should have said this. When I did go to India, the Mandali, I don't think I've ever met finer people, and that's certainly influenced me. So I should have said that.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Don't walk away. Yeah.
No.